You're listening to Trek FM.
Want to join in the conversation and share your thoughts on this episode? Join the Babel Conference, our listeners' discussion group on Facebook. Just type BABEL into the Facebook search field, and we'll look forward to seeing you there.
This is Steve Sansweet of Rancho Obi-Wan, and you're listening to the 602 Club.
Hello and welcome to the 602 Club, coming at you from grungy 80s New York. I am just one of the hosts here, Matthew Rushing, and with me, coming in all of her spectral glory, Christy Morris.
Hello. I'm so excited to talk about this one, and maybe we'll even break out the ecto coolers.
I hope so. Oh, man. You know, I do think that is the real, tragedy of this film, is not having a, Slurpee flavor to go with it. Maybe there was back in the day, but it feels like there should have been a Slurpee flavor, you know.
Something slimy.
And green. Yeah, absolutely. So, well, this week we are going to dive into the original Ghostbusters from 1984, since there is going to be a follow-up to this coming out this summer, so we figured that would be fun to do. Before we get there, though, just want to say thank you for listening, and make sure, as you're listening to the show, subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and that way, once we publish the show, you get it immediately. If you are on Apple Podcasts, it's been a long time since we've gotten a review, and if you're listening to the show and have never given us one on Apple Podcasts, help out the show, help it grow. It really is the thing that helps us kind of rise in search rankings and all the crazy things that happen over there. But yeah, if you like what we do, we'll also read your review out on the show. But you can find us wherever podcasts can be had, so it doesn't have to be on Apple Podcasts or an Apple product. You can also find us on Twitter at TrekFM. We're on Facebook at facebook.com/TrekFM. We've got a listeners-only discussion group called the Babel Conference that you can join on Facebook, as well as going over to Trek.fm. There's a contact section where you can send Christy and I an email. We want to say a huge thank you to our associate producers here on the show through Patreon: Ken, Tripp, Davis, Grayson, Maillet, Daniel, Noah. They have been supporting the show for a long time, and they've been doing that through Patreon, which is the way you can make sure that all of the content here on the Trek FM network keeps coming to you each and every week. It's very expensive to do this, and so we can't do it alone because we as hosts, we don't have that much money together. Make sure that you go over to patreon.com/TrekFM. You can be part of our team. We've got some great contribution levels, but in the end, honestly, every little bit helps. And again, that's patreon.com/TrekFM. Now, Christy, this is something that I'm very interested in because I have not asked you about since we decided to cover Ghostbusters, but I'm wondering what your first Ghostbusting experience was like. Is this a movie that you grew up with? Is this a movie you maybe saw a little bit later in life as a teenager, or did you just see it for the first time? What was your experience?
Yeah, it's nice when you and I get to have these conversations about our childhoods and everything, and what we've seen and stuff. But I've actually saw this one when I was pretty young. I did ask my dad this time if he remembered when the first time was that he showed it to me, but he was like, there's a lot of things I remember about you, dear, but I don't remember that. I was like, okay. But it was probably when I was 8 or 9 years old. I was born in 1987, so it was a little bit later after it came out. I did not get to see it in theaters, but it was always something, again, that my dad and I shared because of our love for sci-fi and fantasy. So there was that viewing together with my dad at home, because my dad used to do this thing, I don't know if you remember, Matt, with videotapes. You could record movies off TV.
Oh, yes. Yeah, we had a lot of movies that's how.
So we had some of those. Yeah. So we watched it that way. And then also from going to Dragon Con with my dad and uncle, when I was starting at 12 years old, I would see every year in the parade the Ghostbuster car. Definitely grew up on it.
Yeah, this is funny because this is one that I did not grow up on. Having watched it again now, I can realize why. This wasn't a movie my parents were going to show me at that point in my life when I was younger, because this really is not a children's movie, even though, Stranger Things make it seem like every kid had seen Ghostbusters back in the 80s. So yeah, I didn't see this one until, a few years back. I'd watched it, and, I would say then it was like, oh yeah, this is not bad. It's okay. But I think, it was interesting because rewatching this the other night, my opinion changed as to what I thought of the movie. So I think I'm really interested to be able to dive into this talk about it. But sometimes movies from, like, say, the 80s where, they're cult classics and everything, like, if you didn't grow up with them, they just don't, like, you never have the same feeling towards as other people who, like, really love them. So I'm just really interesting because I'm thinking that I don't know. As we talk, I may have gotten a little bit closer to this. So, yeah, I mean, really interesting thing about this movie that I was just doing some research about and reading is I like to do when I cover a movie, this age, and that they kind of go for a more realistic take than they normally than the original idea, which was Dan Aykroyd wanted to do this movie with John Belushi, and they were going to basically be going through space and time as these, kind of paranormal specialists. They would be combating, like, demons and supernatural forces and whatnot, I guess, if they traveled through space and time. So maybe they're like the American versions of the Doctor Who. I don't know. But, Jim Belushi dies, and Aykroyd teams up with Harold Ramis to rewrite the script, who was also in the movie, as Egon Spengler. And what they do is they really, they bring the movie so much more down to earth. Like, one of the things they do is they set it in, New York City, which is a really interesting choice because by that point in history, New York City is a pretty rough place and doesn't have the best reputation with the crime and the rundown the city has experienced. And so I just thought first, that was a really interesting way to go, is to make the movie. They put it in a very real setting. They set it in New York. They film a lot of stuff in New York. So it feels very much like this is happening, which is kind of strange.
Yeah, I was thinking about why this movie became such a hit right out the gate, and I think it's a big part because of exactly what you're saying, Matt, that it appealed to the everyman kind of mentality. It really represents four guys that are just trying to get a good job and make ends meet, and they're doing the best they can. And admittedly, Venkman is maybe not doing the best he can.
No.
Taking advantage of women with his pseudoscience, but the rest of them, they're really like the blue collar guys, and they're really intelligent, but they just can't seem to get a good break until this blows up. And it feels like something that a lot of people just going through the everyday motions of life could identify with. For that reason. And then also being set in New York. It's funny because if you think about a lot of other 80s movies around that time, like Crocodile Dundee, for example, it's always showing New York in different ways, but trying to make it feel like that classic thing that people loved before. And so I'm glad that this kind of renewed people's love for New York as well. I think, too, that it really appeals to people because we did get really fascinated in the paranormal around that time as well. After this is when Miss Cleo came about. People got really into calling the 1-800 numbers on TV and getting their tarot card readings or finding out if they had psychic abilities. Still, even mediums have become popular. So I think that it also appeals to people that are believing in those kind of things.
Yeah, and I think, I think one of the things by making the movie feel more realistic is, I guess, the term. I think one of the things that they do that's really smart is by doing that, they never explain anything in the movie, which is, I think, a real plus to the film. They just kind of plop you in with these characters, and they are talking about all of these things, and all of these paranormal ideas, and these, they start quoting like what kind of apparition it is and everything, and they never really even explain their equipment or anything like that. They just make it seem like this is all so normal. And then the setting that they put the movie in, which is New York City, a place that people are very familiar with. And, again, there's nothing really super fantastical until the last third of the movie. Mm-hmm. And so I think what that really helps you do is buy into this being a real thing. And part of that is like, I think even the humor plays into that kind of realistic setting where the cavalier nature to which these guys are doing all these things, I mean, they're wearing proton packs on their back with, unlicensed atomic regulators and whatnot. And like, yeah, I mean, they even turn it on for the first time and they kind of like the other two guys back away from it. It's like, there's a lot of realism to what's going on, and part of that is because the guys just make you believe that all of this stuff is real.
Right, and don't weigh you down with a ton of jargon.
Yes. Yeah, and then the jargon they throw out at you, they make it seem like, oh, you should know this stuff, right? And part of that really helps you believe that this is a real thing in some ways.
Yeah, well, and even making some of the things look realistic. Like, if you were going to trap a ghost, what would you put it in? Oh, a box. It doesn't seem that fantastical. You're like, okay, that makes sense. Sure. That suspends my disbelief just enough. And then, where do they put the box when they have to empty it into another box with a lever? They make it pretty easy for you to get. But I like that they didn't weigh it down with a ton of descriptions or anything. You just are expected to understand this is how the thing works, and, let's move on to the next more important thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, I just think it's what it does is that this kind of more realistic, kind of gritty setting of New York City and, where these characters are and everything, it actually helps you buy the movie in a way that, almost if they had tried to really explain things and all, like that would have made it feel less realistic in some ways. I don't know if any of that makes sense, but I just really think that they did a smart job with all of that. And it made me feel like then the rest of the movie is like I'm buying everything that they're selling at that point. I think that's the thing. Like I'm just more easily able to buy what they're selling in the film, and then just go with the humor of it all because of the way that they have done this setup, and so I think it just really helps the fantasticalness of the movie feel more quote unquote real, even when especially by today's standards it's pretty cheesy special effects and stuff, but I go with it because these guys are earnestly selling the film by the way that they're interacting with all of this stuff.
Right.
Yeah, and their comfort level with it, or, maybe not so much comfort level with it, especially like when the first times then, that they interact with ghosts and everything, like that they're freaked out and that kind of stuff. Like all of it, it just seems very natural and normal. And it just, I don't know, just really, especially this time watching it, it really worked for me.
I'm glad to hear that because I've loved it for a long time. And I think that one thing also that makes this work so well and feel so natural, like you're saying, Matt, is that a lot of the scenes ended up being ad-libbed. I don't know if you knew that, but there was a scene, for example, toward the beginning, if you recall, when the bookshelf falls and Venkman says to Ray, "Has that ever happened to you before?" And he's like, "No." And it's so funny because apparently that was an accident. While they were filming, the bookshelf just happened to fall over. And they were like, "Oh, let's just leave that in. It works better than cutting it out."
Yeah, I think that's part of having the guys that they do in the film, is that, they're such gifted comedians. They're so gifted at what they do that, again, they really help sell the movie by kind of giving this more realistic take. Again, like, this just feels like these guys. It feels real because a lot of the characterizations, especially, obviously... I don't think Peter Venkman is all that far off from who Bill Murray kind of is in real life in some ways,
right.
Just his character. And it's kind of the same character that Bill Murray plays in just about almost every movie. Like, he's literally the same type of character in Groundhog Day and stuff like that. So, again, I think it just really helped. And so, which I think, speaking of, the cast of the movie, I think people love this movie in general, is because the cast sells it to us. Like, they, and I think that really does start with, and this movie really skyrocketed Bill Murray even farther, if that was possible. I mean, like, this put him on the map like crazy, even though, he had done things like Saturday Night Live and Stripes and things like that.
And Caddyshack.
Caddyshack. This is a movie that helps make him even more of a household name, if that was even possible.
And, it's like, now, after seeing so many Bill Murray movies, I definitely see that he did often play the same kind of character, but it was his thing. That is why other people absolutely love him, is the way that Bill Murray can play this guy that's very uncaring of what anybody thinks, and thinks he's a real ladies' man, but just can't seem to get anywhere. And it's just hilarious and adorable at the same time. And then he gets these great lines that you don't expect that add so much to the comedy of the movie, like when they're messing with Mr. Peck.
Yeah, I mean, so I did want to ask you this. So, and just especially as a woman, do you feel like, do you feel like this movie could be made today with the portrayal of him, or do you think he would have been seen as being too much kind of a creep, especially with him like hitting on, college age students at the school? I don't know if this works as a portrayal anymore. I mean, because let me put it this way. And there's no other way to say this, but I think that Bill Murray, in many of his performances, comes off as playing the lovable ass in his movies. Like, I just don't know any other way to say that. Like, that's just what he portrays a lot of the time. But the way that he kind of, especially, I think he was like, the way he pursues Dana, the way he's pursuing, one of his students and everything, it felt a little, I don't know, maybe I'm just a little being too sensitive or something. So that's why I'm going to ask you.
No.
It just felt a little swarmy.
Yeah. I think especially in the beginning, it becomes very obvious what he's doing when he's only electrocuting the male student and he's giving the female student all this praise and then asking what time she can come back later at night. And, when he's a professor and she's a student, especially, it comes across creepy. But then also that she seems so much younger than him, and that he's doing it in this way that's very, just awkward, and you can tell what he wants out of the relationship. It is gross. That scene in particular, it goes a little bit too far for me. So I will say that's my one criticism of the movie, is that I don't like that scene. I think they could have done it a little bit less on the nose with that, and it still would have worked for what they're trying to make Venkman like. But it didn't bother me as much the way that they have him interact with Dana, because he does stay behind the line of inappropriate. And then, of course, later when he had the opportunity to take advantage of her, thank goodness you find out he is a good guy and doesn't do that.
Right. Well, and I will say this too: the difference between Dana and him is she's a fully grown woman who can make up her own mind as to how she wants to deal with this guy coming onto her, right? And at the beginning of the movie, she disregards him and doesn't want anything to do with him. She tells him to leave, and he does, and all. So, that's different than I guess the power dynamic that you get with him preying on a student. You're just like, oh, that's just super creep, dude.
Right. It's like using the respect she has for him as a teacher to then twist it into something gross.
Exactly. And it's just, it's something I think we're a little bit more cognizant of today, and that, those kind of things, just not appropriate. So, and I think that's okay for us to be able to call out, because I don't think then it was appropriate either. It's not as though this behavior should have been appropriate then.
Yeah, but it's crazy because you do have to say around that time in the 80s, so many movies were known for being this inappropriate and worse.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. No,
it was a sign of the times, unfortunately.
Yeah. But Bill Murray is hysterical in this role, when they're talking to the mayor about all the things that are going to happen, and he's like, dogs and cats living together, just his ad-libs are really funny. In the movie, I think, he is at his full Bill Murray-est in this film in many ways. And yeah, I mean, he kind of becomes the one that most people pay attention to, I think, in the film. People tend to really pay attention to him because he's the loudest. And honestly, too, I was doing some research. He's actually probably the reason that we don't have Eddie Murphy in this movie, because the studio wanted, Bill Murray to have a bigger role, and therefore, we actually don't get Eddie Murphy in the role of Winston. Honestly, because of that, because he would have overshadowed. Winston got really condensed, because they wanted Bill Murray to have more of the spotlight. So,
and I will say on the rewatch, I was surprised at how much more you do see Bill Murray than you do the other three guys. I just didn't remember it being that big of a difference. I wish we had gotten more Winston, and I wish we had gotten more Harold Ramis.
Yeah, no, I agree. And Harold Ramis as Spengler, I think, is hysterical, and part of that is because he plays that cold, calculated scientist who is the straight man for the group so well, and then his relationship that he has with Annie Potts' character Janine is hysterical, because they really kind of gravitate toward each other because of that. And I thought it was very funny. And I just enjoyed his character, and his very dry deliveries were fantastic.
Oh, yes. His scene when he says that he collects spores, molds, and whatever.
Yes.
Oh my God. And he just says everything in the most matter-of-fact way. That dryness is what makes him so funny. I always wondered what he must have been like off-screen to hang out with, if he was the same kind of person or if he was a completely different personality to that. But, sadly, we will never know, since he passed away in 2014. But I did want to make sure to mention that it's been nice to see the homage that all of the rest of the guys have paid to Harold Ramis, and said how integral he was to writing this, as well as the character he played.
I mean, it is him that we owe the fact that this was taken and put in New York. He wanted this movie to be a New York movie. And I think they made the right decision. I think he made absolutely the right decision in helping, give that idea to Aykroyd and then them running with it. I think it absolutely works. So I really, I appreciate his portrayal in the movie. And again, I think he just adds a lot because, the what's interesting is, you have the three different personalities and, Bill Murray is the mouthy one and, Harold Ramis is basically the scientist. And then Dan Aykroyd's character Ray is kind of like the go-getter, and just the one, the glue that kind of keeps everybody together. And he's just kind of like a happy-go-lucky guy. One of my favorite lines of his, too, is when he's talking like, oh, man, we have to go back to the real world. Yeah, I loved academia. All the money and and you didn't have to have any results. Like, it was very funny. Very true in some ways. But I loved his character. And again, I think he kind of feels like the glue that keeps the other two guys together and keeps, he's the one who makes everything too. Like he seems to be the brains behind the group in the sense of like being the mechanic.
Yeah, that's true. Actually, he's the guy that puts together the traps and the way that the ghost disposal system is going to work, and explaining what their energy needs are. He kind of starts to encroach a little bit on the scientist role of Harold Ramis, but they do a good job still of making sure that you discern the difference between the two of them, and that really Spengler is more of the bookish guy, and that Ray is more of the heart of the group. I really love Ray having his moment when Venkman says, "Go get her, Ray." That was hilarious.
Yeah, I think that the other thing about Ray too is that he is the optimist of the group. He's the one who is he really is the one who's like in this for the science. He's in this for the excitement of it all. He's in this for the sheer enthusiasm of it. I think that's what makes him like so wonderfully fun in the movie, because he's like an effervescent child in some ways about all of this. And so and I think he's needed in that because he's needed against the cynicism that you get with, Bill Murray's character in the cold hard science of Harold Ramis's character. So right. Yeah, I just think the movie is cast very well in that, and I really appreciate what they do with the characters in that. So it's just really cool.
And although she doesn't get much of a part in this, I do have to give a shout out to Annie Potts, because I love her in Pretty in Pink. And this was the first time I had ever seen her in a movie, was actually Ghostbusters. And she just is so good at that snarky tone. And then of turning it on completely differently when she's around Spengler and showing, like when he comes out from under her desk, the way she's just acting like this is a normal everyday thing. And it's like, well, usually you would get up and leave the room if a guy is under your desk.
Yeah, that was great because it doesn't come across as any other way. Like you could, if it obviously it's Bill Murray in that scene, like it's totally different, right? It's a sexual innuendo type of joke. Whereas with those two, it's like, no, this is just matter of fact. No, he's putting my computer together. This has nothing to do with anything else, kind of thing. Which
it's more of a meet cute than creepy.
Yes. Because that's the moment where then they talk about, what their hobbies are and how she likes to read, and he's like, the written word is dead. And, he gives his line about collecting spores and fungus. So, all of that works because of those two. Like, I think, all of that works because of them, which is really, really fun. Like, I think they just are really fun characters. So, what did you think about Rick Moranis' Lewis?
I loved him because I also love Rick Moranis. He's adorable, and I wish he would be in everything, but he decided to leave the spotlight. And that's his choice, but he was great. I also loved him in Honey, I Shrunk the Kids. But yeah, he's so good at this adorable kind of loser that, he tries so hard to reach out and talk to people, and maybe kind of has a crush on his neighbor Dana, but she's just not interested. And he's an accountant he's trying to come across as cool, and he just can't seem to get what he wants in life.
I think that's the thing that I thought was really, I mean, he plays the very classic geek, you know, and he does it really, really well. He does it with kind of a lot of pizzazz, and it's pretty funny. And so I definitely enjoy that about how he does that. You know, it's interesting because, you know, he becomes a character who's a little bit more of a plot need because they need a second person, you know, to
right,
you know, and so with that, I mean, I don't have a problem with it, but his character isn't quite as important, and it's meant to be much. I mean, he's obviously just pretty much comic relief for the most part, and again, that's not a bad thing. It just is what it is. But he does it well. I mean, that's the thing is, Rick Moranis was very good at like knowing what this character was and playing it to the nth degree. And it's great, you know, like that. He's funny.
Well,
So-
and especially if you look at the difference in Sigourney Weaver and Rick Moranis before they transform into the Gatekeeper and the Keymaster, and then after, that shows off their acting chops right there. Because, I mean, he did such a good job of turning into this, you know, like he's in a trance kind of guy with the, you know, helmet on his head where they're trying to figure out what's going on inside his brain. And he's just keeps saying, I'm the Keymaster. I thought that the whole scene of Rick Moranis trying to talk to Spengler was so funny, and he keeps handing him things.
Yes, like, yeah, and even just, I think one of the things that makes it good is, like, there's such a juxtaposition between those two characters as well, even when they just meet in the hallway. You know, you can already tell she's a very successful kind of metropolitan woman, and he is successful in what he does. He lives in the same building, but he's also, like, the accountant that has a hard time learning how to talk to people, you know, and all of that. And so, like, again, like you said, the way that they play it together is pretty well done. And so, yeah, I really liked, I thought he was funny in the movie. Sigourney Weaver, what did you think of, you know, her and her character Dana, and then of course, you know, getting to play Zool as well?
I think she kind of steals the show. I mean, not to tout Bill Murray, but she really shows off how great of an actress she is in, like I said, the transforming from her initial role as Dana into Zool. And definitely when they were actually doing her levitating, apparently she was just wearing a full body cast and was like hanging from a pole. So it's so strange, the amount of different things she had to do just for this role that you don't realize. And then I think that she plays that difference in personality incredibly well, and acting like a dog apparently in her audition was what got her those scenes. I thought that was so funny.
Yeah, I think she does a really good job. You know, again, like you said, she has to play both parts and you know, play one who, you know, obviously the first go with the character, she's much more reserved as a character. She's kind of a little bit more, I would say, slightly, you know, more uptight maybe. And then she has to go to being the completely, like, whacked out, open, you know, almost kind of like she's almost on a weird drug trip type of character.
Yeah.
And you know, and you know, not repressed in any way, shape, or form. And so I think she does it really well, and with a lot of good humor to the way she portrays it too, because even some of her subtle movements when, like, he's trying to, like, you know, settle her down. Peter Venkman is trying to settle her down, and he's like, now cross your arms over your chest. Now let me talk to Dana. And just even some of her subtle movements and everything, I thought were just really funny. And so I like that's the stuff that I was kind of picking up on what she was doing that I thought was really cool. And again, just really well done. And I'll say this, like, Dana's part is kind of minor in the sense, like, she doesn't have as much to do for sure as even the guys, right? But what she has to do, she makes the most of on screen. So I think she does a really good job.
Absolutely. Well, and especially that whole back and forth between her and Bill Murray. First of all, seeing the two of them act together, which are two such big personalities anyway, off screen. But then that whole scene of the back and forth of her trying to sleep with him and him trying to get her to stop was just hilarious. And I think he even saying he gave her some cc's of something. I think it was a tranquilizer.
Yeah, that was pretty funny.
And she's panting like a dog in her sleep.
Yes, that was hysterical. I also, one of the characters, and sadly, you know, we talked about the fact that Ernie Hudson as Winston does not get enough to do in the movie, really. But what he has to do, like, some of his lines were so funny when he's like, so do you believe in Jesus? I don't know. He's like, I do. Man, that Jesus has style. And I was like, it just reminded me of Talladega Nights. He's like, I like to think of my Jesus in a tuxedo t-shirt because it says, I'm serious, but I also like to party, you know?
Right.
Jesus got style. And then, of course, that leads to them talking about, you know, do you know the Bible? And Dan Aykroyd's Ray is like, oh, that reminds me of Revelation, like 7:13, I think it was. And he quotes the verse, and it's like, yeah, for somebody who doesn't really believe in God, you sure know your Bible really well.
Right. Well, and my favorite Winston line, period, which I'm sure is most people's, but this is what he says. If someone asks you if you're a god, you say yes.
Yeah, that was great. That was
the
really
delivery
great.
in that is perfect. Like, you idiot. But yeah, I think that he gets some really great one-liners, but it's also nice to see that the three of them can't do it alone. And that even with that many people, that they were still missing something and found it with Winston. And that, you know, he didn't even have an interview or anything. They were just like, yeah, you got the job, whatever. Let's move on. So I wish we had seen more of why he came to them in the first place, but what we get is still great. And I think that really completes the group and provides that other aspect of like this strong guy who's not like bookish like the rest of them, but he's still willing to jump in with both feet and he's on board and ready to go.
I think that was the thing I was really interested in is that, you know, I feel like this guy does a good job of holding his own with these other massive comedic talents, like, which is great. I think,
yeah,
you know, anytime that he has a funny line or anything, it really works for me. And I liked his character and I wanted more of him. And it kind of makes me want to see Ghostbusters 2 just to see if he has a larger role than in that movie. So
right, yeah, same here. And it's nice to see. I don't know how much you've seen of these guys off screen talking about it in interviews or doing signings or anything, but I actually saw Ernie Hudson at Dragon Con as well. I didn't get his autograph because I just didn't have enough money, but he's really proud, all of them are, to have done this and for what it did for their careers, but also just seeing what it's meant to fans. So I hope that people do realize that Ernie Hudson even doesn't feel like the role being condensed for Winston in this movie took away as much from the character as some people might think.
That's cool.
Yeah.
What did you end up thinking of the Walter Peck character?
I thought he was hilarious. I thought he was perfect, the perfect depiction of what I would think of as a, you know, uber rule following government rep that's sent to shut the place down. I do feel like he gets a bad rap because he's probably is just doing his job, but you know, he wants to get it done and they're being difficult. But then too, if you see it from the guy's perspective, from the Ghostbusters, they feel like he's coming in and making all these assumptions and then blaming the explosion on them when it was his fault to begin with for shutting it down. You see it from both sides.
Yeah, see, that was something that I thought was really interesting. Obviously, the thing I realized, the more than any other character, he's a plot device.
Mm-hmm.
They needed a character to come in and do what he did so that they could, then have all the spirits released. So then, all of the other supernatural stuff can happen. But I think it's also kind of like an archetype, to have the character who's going to come on and stand against you. And what was interesting is that he's so against these guys when everybody else in the city seems to love them. Like even the police are bringing them, Lewis's character when he's, possessed because they don't know what to do with him. And they're like, well, you guys work with this stuff, so here, you take him, So it would just seem interesting that this one part of the government had an axe to grind. And so it made me wonder, was it not just, Peter Venkman being a jerk to him? Was it something else that, has caused him to not like these guys or something? Because it just seemed kind of odd for him to be the one person in the city who's kind of pissed off at these dudes there's no real apparent reason other than his interaction with Venkman.
I wondered in my own headcanon if it was also just that he, like I said, is such a rule follower that he's coming in and trying initially to understand what's going on there and how it could possibly affect the environment and doesn't get it. So then he turns on them. That's what I thought to myself anyway.
But the actor was funny in the role. The whole scene where they go back and forth with him in the office of the mayor was, hysterical. And, so... And I think he plays it so straight. Again, he plays it so straight so those other guys can go crazy around him. And it works perfectly. Like, he does exactly what he needs to do in the role to make the story itself work. And, too, he does a great job of being that character in the movie that's against your heroes that you hate.
Yeah.
And, in classic 80s form, he's like... the principal in The Breakfast Club and, or Ferris Bueller's Day Off or, any of those type of movies is that you have that character. And again, it's kind of like, there's probably some reasons that, they give in these movies about why those characters are the way they are, but in some ways it's just inexplicable and you don't really care. So,
yeah, there's always one.
Yeah, there's always one. So kind of rewatching the movie now and, how do the ghosts work for you and how does this kind of it's kind of a strange story about an ancient Babylonian god returning because of weird cult followers building a building that's like an antenna for spiritual forces. So it's a pretty whacked out story.
It's funny because since I did grow up on it, I remembered it in my mind as being better effects than I realize now they actually were. But I mean, for the time, they were pretty revolutionary and we hadn't seen a lot of those kinds of things on screen before. So I can look back and say, hey, it was a 1984 movie and the lightning looks just like it did in Highlander. So I'm okay with it. And I still love Slimer. I think that little green ghost was adorable, but also disgusting. And you constantly want to see him on screen. I did think it was crazy how many times sometimes they added more horror elements. Like when you're thinking Ghostbusters, you don't think that you're going to see the librarian come at you and start looking like a dead mummy, or the taxi driver that looks like a corpse driving a taxi. Those I didn't expect to see again. I don't know why I didn't remember seeing them in the first place, but it freaked me out all over again.
Yeah, I think, it was interesting because this is the first comedy movie that had an extensive special effects budget, which you can see that they're absolutely putting everything they can with the technology they have at the time, and I think for the most part it works. I think probably the worst effects, the ones that don't really hold up, are the guardians that we get, the dog-like
yes, the dogs.
creatures. They do not look good for the most part.
Their jumping is really bad.
Yeah. And I was reading it. It took them forever to film the scene of them getting across the street when he's supposed to be chasing Lewis. So, but beyond that, I think everything, even the Stay Puft Marshmallow Man is just, it works. It looks funny. I think the goofiness of that is smart for Ghostbusters. Again, instead of going really super creepy and scary, they go with something that's just utterly ridiculous. Mm-hmm. So they do kind of tread that line of, is this a movie you would show kids, right? By going that direction, they make it much more kid-friendly in that way, even though the rest of the movie and the innuendo is not kid-friendly, I would say. Right. But, and then I think they kind of do something smart in the sense that they create this weird cultish thing and, the Babylonian god and all that kind of stuff. And you just kind of buy it because it feels like one of those weird conspiracy theory things.
Right, yeah. You're like, well, I know cults are bad, so.
Yeah, exactly. So I think all of that really works. And again, the effects are what they are from the time, and I'm not going to judge them too harshly for obviously not living up to 2020. Right. So I think they still do the job they need to do for the movie, and they don't take anything away from it, even now.
And, adding in the other practical effects that enhance what they're trying to do with the special effects, like goop left behind from Slimer to say that, that's what he does, is he just gets all this disgusting muck everywhere, was great. And it then they have Ray coming in and acting like this is this new revolutionary thing. Like, oh my gosh, there's physical elements of, spirit forces here in our world and we're touching them. And you're like, Ray, that's gross. So I loved that they added those little pieces that were cheap and easy to do, but made it more tangible.
Yes. No, I agree. I think you're absolutely right. How did the music work for you? Because obviously, main theme, Ghostbusters, still works for everyone. But how did the rest of the music for the soundtrack and then the other popular music that they kind of added in throughout the film work?
I thought it was fine. I think obviously the title song is the thing people remember the most. But I especially romanticize kind of the sound of the siren on the Ghostbusters car, because that's something that I feel like you hear that noise and you immediately know what you're about to see. And then I've heard it when I was watching the Dragon Con parade with my dad and would see the car coming up the street and all the people dressed as Ghostbusters coming out and walking around it. That always makes me happy. But yeah, I think that it was good. There were times when I wouldn't have known what song to use when you're looking into the spirit world anyway. So it got a little weird, but yeah, overall, I like it. What about you?
Yeah, I don't actually have too much of a problem with it. I don't love when they do the soundtrack, and I don't love the 80s synth when they go, because at the beginning of the movie, they start off with, obviously, the Ghostbusters theme, song, which is awesome. But then they go to a more symphonic score, like a classical score. And then throughout the movie, they drop in these songs of the day, pop songs of the day, whatnot. And then there are some places where they kind of go to the synth score. And I just don't love 80s synth. So in those places, It doesn't quite work for me. And part of it, just because there's a cheesiness to it. And because it feels cheap to me for the most part to do synth. And so I wish that they had just kind of stuck with one type of soundtrack instead of kind of mixing it up. But, we all remember Ghostbusters music as just being the Ghostbusters thing, and
right,
it still works. So,
And I mean, it's exactly what you were saying it is, as far as it's a sign of the era it was made in. It wasn't made to be this timeless thing with classical music throughout. I think that it kind of sets itself up because of being a comedy as well, and then being, in the early 80s with the big hair and everything, that it was going to use some synth and be very typical of the era that it was in.
Yeah. So an interesting question, I think, before we wrap up, something that you had kind of brought up to me was, why does this movie become a cult classic? Like a movie that just still has the heart of so many people. Why do you think it's endured?
I think because it appeals to all of us in a way that we can relate to. I think that having it be 4 guys that are just trying to get by and end up stumbling into this career make it so relatable on a level that anybody could understand. And it's not all of this jargon that you wouldn't understand or that's over your head to make you feel like this is above your pay grade or something. It feels like these are everyday guys and that they're friends, and in spite of their flaws or whatever, that they make it work, and that you're kind of along for the ride with them. That in the beginning, you can tell, obviously, Venkman is not really believing that they're going to see a ghost until they actually do, and then he's completely proven wrong and brought in for the ride. So I think that it took off like it did because it was so relatable on that base level.
Yeah, that's really, I just hadn't really thought about it, but I think you're really on to something about this being about 3 everyday guys, even though one of them was a PhD, although, paranormal psychology. Okay. Whatever that means. But yeah, and I think that what was kind of interesting too is, in some ways, Venkman is kind of the Indiana Jones type character where he doesn't believe in the supernatural, even though he's a part of this group, Indiana Jones. He doesn't really believe in the supernatural, but by the end of, Raiders of the Lost Ark, he definitely believes in it by that point. And so this movie is about these guys really, like you said, they're finding their place and they're finding what they're good at. And it's kind of the classic American story, right? You can, that thing of, you can be anything you want to be, kind of thing. I think people like that. And I was watching it with my wife the other night, and we were just surprised at how well it still works. Like the humor really came out, and to me, the movie stuck with me in a way that it hadn't the first time I saw it. And so, I think that's the thing that I was coming to with why it's still a cult classic, is because I feel like this is one of those movies that even if you didn't grow up with, you can watch it now and still at least appreciate it for why it's popular. And more than that, you may actually like it.
Yeah.
And so I'm really interested to see for you, obviously you grew up with this. Where is your rating for Ghostbusters?
So I will tell you, I rated it on Vudu on the app after I watched it because I had to rent it this time. And I gave it a 5 out of 5 stars, which I will do again. Because in spite of that one little criticism I have about how women are kind of portrayed in this era of movies, it's not only this movie that has that issue. And it's not too bad. It's just that one scene at the beginning that bothers me. So overall, I think it's a near perfect movie. And for me, it is also because of the nostalgia. But I think that it has a lot of heart, and it shows everyday people overcoming extraordinary odds in a funny way. And I saw also when I was looking at more like behind the scenes stuff that Harold Ramis said that he thinks it works so well, especially for the younger generation, because it enables you to deal with death better. That it has people facing the possibility of death and not being afraid and understanding that no matter what happens with them, what you believe in, that they're standing up and not being afraid. So I think that was something I didn't realize on the surface that you're thinking about when you're watching this movie, that I was like, that's really insightful. So
yeah, when I first watched this movie, I had it at 3 out of 5. And so when I went back to rate it again, it's 4 out of 5, so it's went a whole star for me. I really enjoyed this movie. It was actually one I was thinking, I should maybe pick this up so I could buy it and so I can watch it anytime I want. It's really fun. Again, I think most of it still really works, except for what we talked about. I think the movie just has a sense of joy to it. I think that may be the thing that sticks with people, is there's just a joy to this movie. And I think it's partly because everybody who's making it seems to be having a really good time doing it. And I think it works still, which, to watch a movie that is this old and I still feel like for the most part holds up is good. So, it's so much fun. And I'm really interested, if you want us to cover Ghostbusters 2, let us know. And we'll definitely be covering the newest Ghostbusters that'll come out this summer. So it'll be really interesting
Afterlife.
to get to that. Yeah, Afterlife. So, but Christy, I think it's time to recommend something with recommendations.
Yes, I've actually got a really interesting one this time, and you might not expect from my other recommendations, but I was looking through Netflix the other night and noticed a new documentary that I had not known was even coming out, which is called Betty White, First Lady of Television. And I'm sure you've probably noticed, Matt, that Betty White has surged in popularity again. But she's somebody that I really have always admired, not only for her work on Golden Girls, sorry. From her work on Golden Girls, but also everything she's done since then, and how she really kind of reinvented herself as this slightly offensive character that you don't expect out of an adorable old woman. So, I highly recommend watching that documentary on Netflix, Betty White, First Lady of Television. It really shows you a lot about how her career started and how she's really a self-made woman who was gaining popularity at a time when women were not the primary people on screen. So I think you'll really enjoy it.
That's cool. For me, so with the new Dune movie that's coming out at the end of the year from Deneuve, which I'm so excited about, I decided to reread Dune. And then I decided to also continue with the series, which I've never done. So I'm recommending reading Dune if you've never read it, which is a fascinating book. It's so good. I liked it so much more the second time I've read it now than the first time. And then I just read Dune Messiah, which is the second book in the series, and I found it just as good and fascinating. So I'm recommending those two books to you, especially with the fact that we have the new Dune film coming out at the end of the year. So,
and I have not read the books, so.
Yeah, I mean, I would say this, Dune is like Lord of the Rings for sci-fi, in the sense of like the type of world that's being created, the amount of detail in it and everything. It's phenomenal. I really loved it. So can't highly recommend it enough. The reread with Dune was fantastic, and then getting in Dune Messiah, I liked it just as much. So yeah, it was great. But Christy, maybe people want to just catch up with you, see what's going on with you, and where can they find you online?
You can find me on Instagram and Twitter at Bespin Bell. And then if you want to talk, sometimes I'm also lurking around the Babel conference. And you can also find me on a couple of other podcasts aside from this one. I do a show pretty regularly with my friend Teresa called Sabers and Spells, where we talk about pretty much anything geeky that we want. And we're changing up our format to be a little more relaxed and less outlined. So I hope you'll stick around for our next episode. And then I do a show on the Fantatrax network called Planet Leia, where myself and 5 other women from around the world talk about our opinions on Star Wars topics. And then lastly, I do a segment once a month on the Star Wars Report called Fashion in 5 about men's and women's Star Wars fashion. So I'm sure we'll have some more stuff for Clone Wars coming up soon for the final season.
You can find me on Twitter, Instagram, Letterboxd, and Vero under the name MattRushing02. I'm here in the network. I also do The Orb with Chris Jones. When we get a chance, we get together and we talk about Star Trek Deep Space Nine. I am on the Nerd Party Network. I do 2 shows over there. One is called Owl Post with Drea Kaufman. We are talking about Harry Potter 1 chapter at a time. I'm doing Aggressive Negotiations with John Mills as we talk about Star Wars each and every week. And then I also do a little show called Cinema Stories with my good friend Courtney as we talk about films through the lens of faith. But thank you so much for joining us.
And I ain't afraid of no ghost.